In this lecture, we are going to explore the works of Aldo Leopold with an emphasis on his essay entitled The Land Ethic. In this seminal work, Leopold lays out a framework for conservation, and one that I believe is relevant to restoration today. It provides us with a framework for why we should restore disturbed ecosystems. So if we look at the intended learning outcomes of this lecture, by the end, you should be familiar with the following. First, you should be able to explain why we need an ethical framework to help us justify restoration. Second, you should be able to articulate and understand how Aldo Leopold's background was instrumental in constructing the land ethic. Third, you should be aware that not everyone agrees with Leopold's land ethic and some of the common criticisms of his approach. And finally, you should understand what the land ethic means for us today, especially when we consider the use, management, and restoration of natural resources. So why should we restore? You may think this is a pretty straightforward question, and when I've asked this question to students before, I usually find something similar to this word cloud when asked, why do we restore? And so if you look closely at this word cloud, you'll see words that describe areas that we need to fix. So these ecosystems provide the benefits we need. So this includes things that you can see here in the word cloud, things like ecosystem services, water, biodiversity, and recreation, to name a few. However, if you look a little closer, you'll see another reason we might want to restore disturbed ecosystems. We see words such as moral and obligation. So this is another reason we restore ecosystems. It is tied to a moral construct because it is the right thing to do. And I think at this point it's important to point out as well that the issue is not just documenting these problems and understanding how things such as deforestation, intensive agriculture, or overgrazing of rangelands, soil loss from erosion, and more extreme land uses such as mountaintop mining all affect ecosystem structure and function. It's pretty obvious in these examples that there are issues with these ecosystems that may require restoration and rehabilitation. It's not hard to see why and how we might need to do that. And all of these are really good reasons to conduct some type of restoration activity. However, I would argue we also need to think about why we would want to restore these systems in the first place. And in many instances, this really derives from a moral or ethical perspective. And so when we start to think about answering the question, what is the right thing to do, we should really think about and consider two basic questions. First, we should spend time considering why we should restore, which really focuses us to think about the ethical aspects of restoration. The second question, and one I assume most of you would want to jump to right away, is a focus on ecological aspects of restoration and is driven by trying to decide on what is our target for restoration. What are we trying to restore to? Are we trying to make this forest look like an old growth forest that we've observed before? Are we looking at this rangeland or this prairie ecosystem and we're thinking about what it looked like prior to European settlement? Oftentimes this is exactly where we jump to when we think about why and what is the right thing to do. But really there's another aspect of this, which is what we'll focus on today, which is really these ethical aspects associated with restoration. And so I also want to drive home here that the answers to these questions are not always clear. And the more time you spend in this field, you'll find that there are almost always trade-offs and demands for how we use lands and natural resources. And your job will be to help balance those and find a way forward. So let's look at an example. This is a degraded sagebrush steppe ecosystem at the Hanford Reach National Monument in south central Washington. This area was one of the last large remaining landscapes dominated by a sagebrush steppe ecosystem in the U.S. However, what you see here is really degraded. repeated high-severity fires associated with the invasion of cheatgrass, and increased ignitions with human land use has resulted in a loss of sagebrush in a landscape dominated by phlox in the spring. It's definitely a beautiful landscape that provides a variety of important features that are important to birds, pollinators, and certainly humans that are interested in colorful landscapes for aesthetic reasons. However, it is not natural. If we were to look at an intact sagebrush steppe ecosystem, also at the Hanford Reach National Monument in south central Washington, we would see something entirely different. This area is going to be dominated by sagebrush that is not as visually appealing perhaps as the phlox, but it does support a variety of endemic species that have been in decline, including sage grouse and pygmy rabbits. But that's not the only difference. Other ecosystem functions are different as well, such as soil productivity, carbon sequestration, and biodiversity. And the question really boils down to which is best, and how do we decide? And so here's another example, just to demonstrate that these issues are international. If we were to go to the Scottish Highlands, we would likely find a landscape that looks like this. This landscape has been modified for centuries and is focused on a patchy structure of open lands maintained by fire to create habitat for red grouse and sheep grazing. And in fact, hunters from around the globe flock to this area for the hunting and hiking opportunities to experience this expansive landscape. And while not natural, these heather moorlands provide numerous ecosystem services, and when considered globally are endangered habitat with the conversion of similar heather moorlands on the European continent. But if we were to go into the highlands, into an area that had not been managed in this fashion, and explored an area that we might consider more natural, we would see something entirely different. In this case, we define natural conifer forest dominated by Pinus sylvestris, or Scots pine. This is a much different environment that supports a vastly different suite of plant and animal species, and has different suites of ecosystem services. Again, the question is which is better? Both provide important habitat and services, but how do we decide which is the type of ecosystem we want to restore to? How do we decide? So let's go back to our earlier question. What is the right thing to do? As I've said before, the right thing to do is not always obvious. People have different perspectives and preferences, and often have different opinions about the targets for restoration, many of which are tied to personal opinions about aesthetics and priorities. For example, should we restore forests back to the pre-European settlement condition? Or was this not natural either, as we have considerable evidence that Native American communities dramatically influenced their environment and may have impacted the distribution of species? We also have to understand and accept that management will require trade-offs for different ecosystem services. And finally, as I mentioned before, decisions can become governed by philosophical debates over concepts of what is natural and what is wilderness or wildlands. These are all things that you will have to deal with, and we need some sort of construct on how to approach these questions. And this is where I think we can turn to the work of Aldo Leopold for assistance. So who was Aldo Leopold? He was one of the earliest conservationists, born in Iowa in 1887. He received a forest degree from Yale, and after spending 15 years for working as a forester with the U.S. Forest Service in New Mexico and Arizona, then moved on to help create the first degree in wildlife management and was the first professor to teach the subject at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And his interests and impacts were extremely widespread. He was instrumental in leading the effort to create the first national wilderness in the U.S. forest system, and was an early pioneer of ecological restoration before it was even considered a discipline. And tragically, he died in 1948 while fighting a brush fire fire on a neighbor's land in northern Wisconsin, well before his time. The other major contribution Aldo Leopold provided was a set of essays that still resonate today. One of those compilations, called the Sand County Almanac, was published after his death and includes several seminal and important essays. These essays recount how many of his experiences led to his understanding of the natural world and greatly influenced his idea of the land ethic. What is perhaps most interesting to us today is that many of his experiences that fed his thoughts about the land ethic derived from hunting. As he recounts in one essay, to forego a sure shot in the tree in favor of a hopeless one at the fleeing bird was my first exercise in ethical codes. In other words, there was a certain fairness in this, where he considered himself more of a part of the system, not one that can master it. Also ahead of his time, Leopold's essays highlight the need to understand the complexity of how ecosystems work, and how we often implement management strategies without really understanding the consequences of our actions. As an avid fisherman as well as a hunter, Leopold captured this thought beautifully, I think, when he wrote, "How like fish we are, ready and eager to seize upon whatever new things some wind of circumstance shakes down upon the river of time." Leopold believed that we need to understand how the ecosystems we manage work, much in the same way we saw Tony Bradshaw write about restoration as the acid test of our understanding of ecosystems. Leopold's understanding of complexity in ecosystems and how we need an ethical construct to underpin our management didn't just develop overnight. It really evolved over a lifetime, starting early with his experiences hunting and fishing in Iowa, through his time in the American Southwest, and then back in the Midwest, teaching wildlife management at the University of Wisconsin. And we can really see that in his essay titled Thinking Like a Mountain. In this essay, he recounts his experiences with wolves. Early in his professional life, he described this experience where he actively worked to remove wolves from the landscape in which he was working. And he wrote, "In a second we were pumping lead in the pack. When our rifles were empty, the old wolf was down and a pup was dragging a leg." He later realized that these actions were really based on managing the landscape for deer, and he believed that predators were not an important part of the system at that time. This view changed over time as he observed the consequences of these actions in the system where he was working. And it was really this observation that was one of the real gifts that Leopold brought to these essays and to his ideas about management. And so, as I mentioned previously, Leopold was really ahead of his time. His writings and thoughts about a land ethic were an important foundation to the field of ecology and have been applied to numerous restoration and land management projects over the years. And while he didn't use the term, his experience with wolves led him to better understand a concept that we now consider a basic tenet of ecology, the idea of trophic cascades. And so if you're not familiar with the concept of trophic cascades, the idea is that predators in a food chain suppress the abundance or alter the behavior of their prey, thereby releasing the next trophic level from predation. What Leopold really observed with wolves was similar to what has been described for the removal of cougars at the top of the predator chain in pyramid in Yosemite National Park. And so in this example, we see that the loss of cougars to hunting pressure in the 1920s and removing them from this landscape of Yosemite resulted in large increases in the population of mule deer, which ate more black oak seedlings, causing a dramatic decline in the species. With this decline in black oak, ponderosa pine was able to invade these areas once dominated by black oak, and then that change in the structure and function of these forest ecosystems, because the mule deer would not eat the ponderosa pine seedlings, resulted in a new plant community that dominated and also impacted ecosystem structure including things like biodiversity and carbon sequestration. Similar examples have been studied in the Yellowstone Basin, especially in Yellowstone National Park. The removal of wolves from Yellowstone from 1910 to 1930 resulted in elk populations that grew considerably. This overabundance of elk moved into the riparian areas, denuded the willows that dominated these riparian forests, which then in turn resulted in increased erosion and shifts in animal species that dominated these systems as the cover changed. One significant change was an increase in coyotes, which in turn resulted in a decline of small mammals, negatively impacting food availability for fox, badgers, and other raptors. However, with the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone, ecosystem dynamics have changed. There are fewer elk, which means both willows and aspen stands long absent have begun to recover, along with a variety of animal species, such as bear, pronghorn antelope, beaver, and cutthroat trout. So let's now look at the land ethic as developed by Leopold and think about how it can be an important aspect of restoration. He writes in his essay, "The hope for the future lies not in curbing the influence of human occupancy. It's already too late for that, but in creating a better understanding of the extent of that influence and a new ethic for its governance." So what can we discern from this statement? First, he does not think humans should really be removed from the system. Rather, he acknowledges the important role that we play. Second, he is one that believes in using the environment and actively managing it. Finally, he argues that to move forward, we really need to understand the systems we manage and apply a basic ethical construct to how we engage and go about managing ecosystems. So in Leopold's own words, this ethic is human-centric, as he contends the individual is a member of a community of independent parts. And he expands this basic construct to the land when he says the land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of this community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals. And this is a key part as he equates the ecosystem with the human community, stating that this land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to a plain member and a citizen of it. And this really harkens back to some of those early memories that he had of hunting in Iowa and being more sporting and thinking about how he as a member of the community really impacts the community dynamics. So if we look at the basic maxim of Leopold's land ethic, it really is this: a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. And this is really simple. So when we think about ecosystem restoration, there really should be some strong parallels to what we learned about Tony Bradshaw's views on ecosystem restoration and rehabilitation. And these similarities are that restored ecosystems should have integrity, or what Bradshaw would have called key structural and functional components. Things such as, are all species present? Are nutrient cycles intact? Is the complexity associated with the arrangement of species? In other words, the stand structure present in this forest or on this rangeland. Leopold also argued that restored ecosystems should also be stable. And for the most part, this really means, will the ecosystem persist? Is it resilient to future disturbances that are outside of the natural range of variability or those disturbances caused by humans? And finally, the restored ecosystem should have some inherent beauty or some aesthetic value. And I'll admit, this is one that's much more difficult to quantify, but does drive home the point that restoration is really a human endeavor and one we really cannot ignore when you're working in a restoration project. Another important maxim or tenet of Leopold's land ethic and related to restoration is really captured in this quote. The cowman who cleans his range of wolves does not realize that he's taking over the wolf's job. And the point here is not to argue that we need wolves roaming across all rangelands, but rather we need to recognize when there are important pieces of an ecosystem that are missing, we have to think about how our management practices can replace the function these missing pieces once provided. So once again, we're really driven to the point with Leopold's writing and his land ethic that we really must understand how the ecosystem works before we can try to put it back together again through some restoration or rehabilitation project. So there are some criticisms of Leopold's land ethic, and it's important to understand these within the context of using this as a framework for restoration moving forward. And the first one is one you may have already had some trouble with, and that is the reliance on this idea of aesthetics. There is considerable evidence that what we believe is beautiful is really linked to a variety of socioeconomic factors. And that makes it extremely difficult to determine this aspect and really link to a restored ecosystem. But it's one that really does drive home this human component, and it's one that you'll want to pay attention to as you move forward. The second criticism stems from Leopold's utilitarian justifications and the values that he makes from a really human-centric focus, which is in some ways at odds with his idea that humans are not the center of ecosystems or this land ethic and really are parts of it. And so you can get caught up in sort of a circular logic with this, and it's clear that Leopold struggled with this himself in later writings after he wrote the essay entitled The Land Ethic. And finally, there are some who argue that Leopold's definition of stability really undermines his argument. And personally, I don't agree with this and would argue that if he was living today with the knowledge that we have about ecosystem science, he would really couch his terms of ecosystems much more as a dynamic equilibrium and not stability. And in many ways, we're really just splitting hairs. So to put this all together and to think about how the land ethic can really be used to promote many of the things we are interested in restoration professionals, there are a variety of things that we can look to. First, this land ethic really helps us and promotes a management for ecosystem structure and function, or the services that these ecosystems provide. And this is really critical because we already learned in our last lecture that this is really what we're after. We're after restoring structure and function of degraded and disturbed ecosystems in a way that moves us along a trajectory of ecosystem development. This tenet and this land ethic also provides an ecological basis for sound management decision making. Right? So it provides us with the basis to integrate ecological principles and ecological information as the foundation of our decision-making process. Again, it goes back to this idea of the basic tenet. A thing is right when it's right, and it's wrong when it's not. Third, the land ethic really helps drive home the idea that complexity and maintenance of ecosystem structure and function is really important, right? And that we should appreciate the function of all species. So it makes us think about the ecosystem as a whole and how things work together. I think it also is useful because it helps us reconsider how we value the resources we utilize and how we develop and increase and focus on what specific parts of the ecosystem we might utilize and how we can use that to help further our restoration efforts. And finally, I think this land ethic really forces us to really understand the systems that we manage, which in turn will lead us logically to approach and restore degraded ecosystems using an adaptive management approach. And this is a topic we'll explore more this semester as we move forward.